Thanks for coming to watch my presentation. How is everything going on today? Okay, the topic is about measuring sustainable psychometrics, modeling in human science, measurement challenges. The key word for today's presentation is psychometrics. What is psychometrics? Psycho is the mind or mental state of a person, and metric means expressing numerical values of it. The mainstream of modern psychometrics theories is item response theory. So whenever you hear of the psychometrics from educational researchers, you may think of they are talking about IRT mostly. Many of you may have heard of the term econometrics, but I think the term psychometrics of IRT or IRT is unfamiliar. Why? I think there have been social reasons why most of us know so little about IRT. First, in my opinion, IRT experts have seemed more interested in communicating with themselves rather than with people from the other disciplines. Second, IRT requires radically rethinking measurement in a model that is not linear. So it's uncommon that scholars become radical. Isn't it surprising that there are some researchers who don't necessarily depend on linearity assumption? So if you are a traditional researcher who prefers the mainstream econometrics theories or more orthodox hard data, you may not like it, but it's okay. One of the goals of this presentation is to refresh our mind and provide applicable methodological perspectives for human science. And the human science is anyway interdisciplinary studies. Okay. I want to show a survey item here. So I agree with the current gun control policy. There are 5 points to choose from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We have experienced this type of question a lot, like course evaluations, right? Here are 2 students, George and Alice, when they received this item with 5-point Likert scale, they all chose the option strongly disagree. So the survey company coded their responses the same. But behind their observed responses, there are quite different subjective reactions from them. First, George is conservative, and he believes that the gun ownership should not be controlled in principle. He argues that any free man should be able to protect himself for carrying a weapon according to the Constitution. What about Alice? Alice is a progressive educator, and she believes gun accidents are serious social problems. So she believes the nation must manage firearms more wisely. You see, they actually have totally different opinions and almost opposite reactions in their mind. But when they responded to the survey item, what happened? They chose the option strongly disagree with the current gun control policy. So in this case, the survey analysis does not capture the nature or nuance of their reaction. Their subjective reactions are located in the two different directions, and it is not measured well by the survey analysis. This is a serious measurement problem. Here is another example. Every year, the Korean government has administered the college Scholastic ability test to measure students' ability at the end of year. We believe the test gives a metric to see relative locations among the students' cognitive attributes. Let's say a student's ability theta. To measure the thetas, what we normally expect is the idea that a low ability student is unlikely to make a correct answer for certain questions, difficult questions. A high ability student will make more correct answers for both difficult and easy questions. On this diagram, B represents the item parameter of easiness or difficulty. This is a very basic idea, and we rarely use the test item characteristics to correspond to students' ability because we can't directly see students' ability, the latent factor. For Korean SAT, the National Psychometrics Agency has used IRT as the analytic technique. Now, let me introduce the definition of IRT. It is a scaling technique in which we attempt to put psychological traits, ability, levels, and the difficulties of the item into the same scale. But what is the reality? Almost every year, we heard of like 불수능 or 물수능. These are Korean slang, and one is ridiculously difficult, and the other test is ridiculously easy. If so, it's hard to trust the assessment result. We feel like the IRT methodology seems not trustworthy, isn't it? Why does this situation happen every year? This is a serious social problem because the college SAT is a high-stake test in Korea. Okay. Let's simplify the scenario using another example. Can we think of a psychometrical trait, anxiety, or a type of pain in medical science? It's a simpler case than the Korean SAT. When I go to a doctor, a nurse gives me a piece of paper. I need to mark the degree of my pain. There are different ways to measure the generalized anxiety or symptom. Although we cannot observe our latent variable, its existence may be inferred from behavioral manifestations or manifest variables, for instance, restlessness, sleeping difficulties, headaches, tremblings, muscle tension, or galvanic skin response, GSR, feedback device to assess sweat gland activity, or self-reports. The cheapest or quickest way to get any relative information on anxiety would be a self-report. The doctor is asking about. Is it represented 1 point on the continuum from 0 to 10 points? You may think of it like 10 points Likert scale, and then you can standardize that into like this theta score between -3 and +3, you can do it. You are using this type of cumulative function. This type of self-report survey is different from the gun control policy survey that we just seen right before. If we might label the ends of the latent continuum, say high anxiety and low anxiety, and low anxiety. So can you distinguish two different characteristics from the cases that I made, such as the gun control survey, ability, and anxiety? Okay, so let's go back to the case with George and Alice. The unobservable reactions from the two students are located apart from the one point in the middle. Psychometricians call it this one point an ideal point. In this scenario, our survey analysis is not going to work with Likert scale because the subjective reactions behind the visible reactions are embedded. Alice and George actually have totally different reasons. So George is in the right wing and Alice in the left wing. And there is a middle point on the continuum of X. If it is a regular Likert scale, it means it is a cumulative function, but the result is kind of misleading because we normally sum them up to describe the average scores of the people's responses. But as we know, we can't calibrate the attribute using such a cumulative function because of the hidden mechanism in it. For this type of question, a conventional survey analysis using the sum them up technique doesn't work at all. Now, let's break down the graph in detail. The x-axis is a subjective preference of the gun policy, and the y-axis is a conditional probability as it is an estimated probability conditioned on the student preference to choose. The subjective responses from George and Alice are opposite, but interestingly, the observed survey responses are the same. They have the strong disagreement to the gun policy. But what about people who have moderate opinions on the gun control? They are around the center on the x-axis. So the graph looks like unfolding. Okay, so but what about the SAT or anxiety scale? It's a cumulative function that shows monotonically increasing when we see high and low levels of psychological traits on the one continuum of the x-axis, depending on whether a student answered the test questions correctly or not. It is coded as 1 if it is correct and 0 if it does not. This is the way how we model a person's ability. The y-axis is the estimated probability of correcting the question conditioned on the student ability. Likewise, an anxiety self-report is modeled in this way because it is monotonically increasing from 0 to 10. Do you see B here? In this IRT model, both persons and items are located on the same continuum. It is possible to make comparative statements about how a typical person might respond to an item. There is no such hidden mechanism as a gun control policy survey because the lower end of the continuum of ability represents less proficiency than the upper end. items located in the lower and require less proficiency to be correctly answered than those in the upper end. All right. Okay. Before we apply IRT to a case study, let's summarize what we have learned so far. So we have two mentalities in psychometrics modeling, such as the ideal point function and the cumulative function. First, ideal point function or unfolding model is based on third zone scaling. This method of constructing an attitude scale not only takes value with subjectively responded item response into consideration while evaluating the final attitude score, but also caters to neutral items and the hidden mechanism with ongoing people's value-laden decision-making. Second, the cumulative function is also known as Gottman scaling. Once you take very first introduction to measurement course at graduate school, you will learn Rush, 2PL, and 3PL models under the umbrella of Gottman's perspective. We don't have enough time to talk about the detailed information about submodels now. So let's have another time for them if necessary. All right. So now let me introduce a case which we can apply the unfolding IRT model. I brought this quote from Chimnell et al. But before we read it, have you heard of foster care and in-home care service before? Do you know what a caseworker is? So let's watch this TV show for 1 minute.
Beth be home? Oh, is she? This is Shaylee from DA Task.
23-year-old Shaylee Anthony is a new caseworker. She has a bachelor's degree and 5 weeks of training.
Right now, I'm most worried about getting attached to kids or families. If we get totally emotionally involved, then it will affect our job and how we deal with the clients. Everybody has values and everybody has their own personal experiences, and you kind of have to forget those to deal with different types of people.
Oh, hi, Beth. How are you? Good. How's everything going today?
Shaylee has been assigned her first case involving serious allegations of neglect. The mother of a 2-year-old boy is accused of keeping him in a dangerous house with a relative Shaylee thinks might be unsafe.
Well, what I called to tell you is that we are going to substantiate you on threat of neglect and neglect to Mark. We have found that you have neglected Mark. Because it doesn't seem as though you're taking anything very seriously and that you've allowed him to stay in this home even after you knew of the safety concerns.
2-year-old Mark and his family live in a rundown farmhouse in rural Maine. There are several adults living in the house. Among them are Mark's mother Beth, his grandmother Leanne, and his step-grandfather Roy, who once pled guilty to assaulting a teenage girl. But the department's most pressing concern is the condition of the house.
The house that they were living in was deplorable living conditions. I brought the fire marshal out, and he said if there was one spark in the house, the whole house was gone up within a half hour.
The one with the house, I could see that one. I could see the house is a little dangerous.
Right? Okay. So we see this kind of vulnerable family, and caseworkers can intervene in the risky family. The child with a bad family can be separated from the family. The two case services are foster care and in-home care. there are more different types of care services in the United States, but to avoid the complexity, I use the only two care settings. The decision on whether a child is relocated to either care is done by mostly the environmental factors of risk or caseworker's discretion. So let's see the statement from Chimnell, the quote. Yeah, this statement has at least two assumptions, right? Regardless of the factuality. The first assumption in this sentence, the child who has a high risk score is likely to be assigned to foster care. The second assumption is children of color are more likely to be assigned to the foster care regardless of the risk level. I'm not interested in whether the content is true or not. My focus is on how to find it out. How do they say that for sure? Not whether it is true or not. I mean, I'm just interested in the method to end that conclusion. So far, do you see any similarity in the modeling between this child care welfare system and any survey item like that we discussed earlier? You don't? Yeah, then try to think about the two care services are response categories from a survey item. The options strongly disagree or not are acting like the options, foster care assignment or not. It's okay not to understand the similarity between the caseworker case and the gun control policy survey for the moment. We will revisit the case anyway again. Risk assessment is a critical part of child welfare practice, and a caseworker decides a child care setting based on clinical judgment, considering professional discretion. A case placement is done, and then the original placement can be transferred to a different care setting. So we can imagine child risk score is located on the care continuum. So with a certain cut point on the axis of the care continuum, some children are assigned to foster care, while others are assigned to in-home care. Okay, so we are gonna assign kids with high risk scores to foster care, otherwise in-home care. Once a kid risk is higher than a cut point on the x-axis, he is placed in the foster care, otherwise in the in-home care. You may think of the foster care as like a treatment group, and in-home care is a control group. You know, dummy variables, 1, otherwise 0. But that's not the only way to decide the care placement. Caseworkers have discretions which see all kinds of financial restrictions or environmental changes other than just the risk score metrics. They have discretion to override. Once the original assessment is changed by the caseworker, then we can code the override decision as 1, otherwise 0. If there is no overrides, it means the caseworker just sticks to the risk score method, because the extreme cases, care placement is obvious. But we know the caseworker often changes the child original placement, so we need to think of there is a hidden aspect, which is caseworkers override to affect the children's psychological outcomes after the care intervention. The outcome can be estimated differently depending on how we can reflect the existence of overrides on the care treatment. then what kind of child is more often overridden than the others? Okay, let's say we have two children, George and Alice again. These kids are 5 years old, and they are different from the earlier occasion that has George and Alice in the gun control policy. Here, Alice has extremely bad parenting environment. Her father was molesting her, so when her mom found it out, she freaked out. Sexual assaults by a biological father or guardians happen more than our expectation. Alice's risk score in the family is very high, like 3 points on the x-axis, which is much greater than the threshold center cut point. The x is standardized risk score. And Alice is obviously placed to a foster care setting by the original scoring because her risk score is really high. In that scenario, the caseworker is unlikely to change or override the original care placement. Meanwhile, George is around the cut score on the middle. He has a mild level of risk in his home. When the caseworker checks on him, sometimes it looks okay, but other times it looks bad. The caseworker is then confused or tempted to override to the care placement if he has different environmental factors to affect the care placement, like financial issues in the county foster care settings. Therefore, override happens near the cut score more than the students like Alice. Does this make sense? So the kids are not just simply or randomly overridden to either care. Let me quickly make another example. A grading system with pass or fail. For one who is really good, you are not likely override the one to the lower grade, right? But for the one who has like around the cut score between pass and fail, you are tempted to override to either grade. I'm talking about the nature of a graded scale of correspondence with a cut point. If you have a certain principle for students who are supposed to have A's or B's or C's or F's, then let's say you have too small number of A's, but in that case, even though you have a percentage scores related to A and B and C and D, originally we have such continuous percentage score to make A and B and C, F, right? You're really tempted to override the B's who are near the cut score between B and A to move it up to the A. So override does not happen randomly. It happened around the cut score all the time. In the caseworker case, we have only 2 care services, so we have only 1 cut point in the center, but we can expand or generalize this case to multiple options like A, B, C, D, and F grading system or survey response options like 5-point Likert scale. In that case, we have 5 different choices. So that means we have 4 cut points. I mean, we can generalize that decision into multiple options. Anyway, we don't want to feel overwhelmed right now, so let's move on. I just want to indicate the caseworker's decision does not occur randomly, so this should be reflected to our measurement model before we set up statistical regression model to do hypothesis testing. Otherwise, the estimation on the student psychological outcome would be biased. Okay, so my goal is how to include this kind of measurement challenges or considerations to correctly estimate the outcome after the intervention. Do you see any difference between study 1 approach and study 2 approach? So study 1 is a typical regression analysis. right? So estimating the impact of intervention on the Y outcome after the certain time. But the study 2 is more than that. The override is reflected to the measurement of how a student becomes a treatment group or a control group. And then the research designs the structure of X variable of treatments and Y variable of student risky outcome. But how can we do it? To capture a more reasonable measurement model, I use a simulation technique because of counterfactual conditions. Okay. Okay, so the Walker override is modeled with a probability density function like this. To use the PDF probability density function is the idea that we normally do a calculus. So to use the PDF, it's just as long as we know how to do calculus, we can do it. We can calculate it. It's not a statistics. This is just mathematics. Yeah. So, okay, so this measurement topic is potentially hot. If you pursue for this kind of counterfactual conditions, we'd better use simulation, or at least if you expect the treatment is ongoing with any hidden factor like subjective reactions or selection bias, then you better model that. Otherwise, your regression model will estimate bias result. So far, do you have any questions, concern? Okay, so I think we have one more slide, but this is a statistical model. So actually, this is not related to psychometrics. So you remember the picture that I just showed. The D is in-home care, dummy code 0, 1, but the D is compounded because of the override. So if you don't consider the measurement of override before you set up this kind of structural model, your estimation of statistical model is all messed up. So you can't trust the statistical result. So that's why we need to consider the measurement before we run the analysis. So my presentation is about here.